The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the spacious garden of Manny Pacquiao's mansion in General Santos City, where the sound of children's laughter filled the warm Philippine air. Manny sat on the wooden bench beside the koi pond, watching his youngest son Israel chase butterflies, while Princess and Queen Elizabeth practiced their dance routines on the patio. The peaceful atmosphere that surrounded his family home had become his sanctuary, a place where the pressures of his legendary boxing career melted away into simple moments of fatherhood. This Tuesday felt no different from countless others, with Jinky preparing dinner in the kitchen and the familiar sounds of home creating their daily rhythm. The iron gates of his property suddenly creaked open as Angelo, his longtime security guard, approached with hesitant steps and a troubled expression that immediately caught Manny's attention. Behind Angelo walked a figure that seemed both foreign and strangely familiar, an elderly man with weathered hands and clothes that spoke of years spent in modest circumstances. The stranger's gait carried a subtle limp, and his eyes held a mixture of determination and fear that made Manny's chest tighten with an inexplicable sense of recognition. As the man drew closer, the afternoon breeze seemed to pause, as if nature itself sensed the gravity of this moment that would forever alter the peaceful landscape of Manny's world. Manny rose slowly from the bench, his athlete's instincts immediately alert as he studied the approaching figure with the same intensity he once reserved for opponents in the ring. The man's facial features gradually became clearer, revealing deep lines carved by time and hardship, yet underneath the weathered exterior lay traces of a face that Manny remembered from the fragmented memories of his childhood. His heart began to race with a rhythm that felt both familiar and terrifying, as if his body recognized something his mind wasn't ready to accept. The children continued their play, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring just steps away from their innocent world. Angelo cleared his throat nervously, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort as he struggled to find the appropriate words for this unprecedented situation. The security guard had worked for the Pacquiao family for over a decade, protecting them from overzealous fans and unwanted visitors, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this particular moment. He gestured toward the elderly man with uncertain movements, clearly unsure whether this visitor represented a threat or simply a complex family matter that required delicate handling. The silence stretched between all three men like a taut boxing ring rope, heavy with unspoken questions and decades of accumulated pain. The elderly visitor stood approximately 10 feet away, his eyes locked onto Manny's face with an intensity that seemed to bridge 3 decades of separation in a single heart-piercing gaze. His clothes were clean but humble, suggesting a man who had learned to live simply, perhaps out of necessity rather than choice. In his weathered hands, he clutched a small, worn envelope that appeared to have been carried for many miles, its edges soft with handling and time. The late afternoon light caught the moisture gathering in his eyes, revealing an emotional vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the hardened exterior that life had forced him to develop over the years of absence. The recognition hit Manny like a devastating right hook to the solar plexus, stealing his breath and causing his legs to momentarily weaken beneath the weight of this impossible reality. Standing before him, after 30 years of complete absence, was Rosalio Pacquiao, the father who had walked away from his family when Manny was just a young boy struggling with poverty and dreams that seemed impossibly large. The man who had left behind a son who would grow up to become one of the greatest boxers in history, who would rise from selling newspapers on street corners to conquering 8 different weight divisions, who would transform from an abandoned child into a global icon whose name would be known in every corner of the world, yet who had never stopped wondering why his father had chosen to disappear from his life when he needed him most. Time seemed to freeze in the garden as father and son stood locked in a moment that neither had ever truly prepared for. Despite the countless times each had imagined this scenario during sleepless nights over the past 3 decades. Manny's hands trembled slightly, not from physical weakness but from the overwhelming surge of emotions that crashed through his body like waves against a rocky shoreline. His mind raced through a kaleidoscope of memories, questions, and feelings that he had buried deep within his heart during his rise to international stardom. The successful businessman, the beloved senator, the legendary fighter, all seemed to dissolve away, leaving only the vulnerable child who had once waited by the window, hoping to see his father's silhouette returning home. Rosalio took a tentative step forward, his aged features showing the accumulated weight of 3 decades spent carrying the burden of his decision to leave his family behind. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse and uncertain, as if the words had been trapped in his throat for years, waiting for this moment of release. The envelope in his hands shook slightly, as he struggled to find the courage to speak the words that had echoed in his mind during countless lonely nights. His eyes, though aged and weathered, held the same deep brown color that Manny remembered from his earliest childhood memories, yet they now carried stories of hardship and regret that had been invisible to his young son all those years ago. The sounds of the bustling household seemed to fade into the background as the 2 men stood in their bubble of suspended time, each studying the other's face for traces of the relationship they had once shared. Manny's training in reading opponents served him well as he observed his father's body language, noting the way Rosalio's shoulders carried the weight of shame and the manner in which his eyes darted between hope and fear. The champion boxer who had faced the world's most dangerous fighters suddenly felt more vulnerable than he had ever experienced in any ring, because this confrontation required no physical preparation, no strategic planning, only the raw courage to face the deepest wounds of his past. Princess and Queen Elizabeth had noticed the change in their father's demeanor and gradually moved closer. Their young eyes filled with curiosity about the elderly stranger who had caused such a dramatic shift in the atmosphere of their home. Jinky appeared in the doorway of the house, her maternal instincts immediately sensing that something significant was occurring in their garden, though she couldn't yet comprehend the full magnitude of this unexpected reunion. Israel continued his innocent play, his childhood oblivion serving as a stark contrast to the emotional intensity radiating from the 2 adult men who stood frozen in their decades-old pain and confusion. Angelo discreetly stepped backward, giving the family privacy while maintaining his protective position, his experienced eyes scanning the perimeter for any signs that this emotionally charged situation might attract unwanted attention from neighbors or media. The security guard had witnessed many emotional moments in his years of service, but the raw intensity emanating from this encounter surpassed anything he had previously observed. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation escalated beyond his ability to manage, though his intuition suggested that this was a deeply personal matter that would require patience and understanding rather than additional security measures. Manny's voice, when it finally found its way past the tightness in his throat, emerged as barely more than a whisper, carrying with it all the pain, confusion, and longing that had accumulated during 30 years of fatherless milestones. The question that escaped his lips was simple yet profound, encompassing decades of birthdays celebrated without paternal presence, boxing victories achieved without a father's pride, and life's most significant moments experienced with an empty space where parental support should have resided. The afternoon breeze carried his words across the garden like a prayer, reaching the ears of the man who had haunted his dreams and shaped his determination through absence rather than presence, creating a moment of reckoning that would forever change both of their lives. The question hung in the air between them, as Manny's mind involuntarily transported him back to their small, cramped house in Kibawe, Bukidnon, where the walls were thin and the poverty was thick enough to suffocate dreams before they could take flight. He remembered being 7 years old, watching through the window as his father packed his few belongings into a worn duffel bag, while his mother Dionisia sat at the kitchen table, her tears falling silently onto the rice she was trying to prepare for dinner. The memory of that final argument between his parents remained vivid in his mind, though as a child, he hadn't understood the complex web of financial pressures, personal failures, and broken promises that had driven his father to make the devastating decision to abandon his family. Those early years after Rosalio's departure had been marked by a struggle for survival that would have broken many families, but had instead forged Manny's character like steel in a furnace. Dionisia had worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses during the day and taking in laundry at night, while young Manny sold newspapers on street corners and shined shoes to contribute whatever coins he could earn to their meager household income. He remembered the nights when they shared a single meal between the entire family, and how his mother would pretend she wasn't hungry so that her children could eat more. The absence of his father during those formative years had created a hollow space in Manny's chest that he had tried to fill with boxing gloves, championship belts, and eventually political service. Yet nothing had ever quite managed to complete the puzzle of his identity. The memories of special occasions without paternal presence flooded back with unexpected intensity, reminding Manny of school events where other children's fathers cheered from the sidelines while he scanned the crowd for a face that would never appear. His first amateur boxing match had been one of the most bittersweet moments of his young life, as he had dedicated his victory to the father who wasn't there to witness his potential beginning to unfold. Even as his boxing career progressed, and his name became known throughout the Philippines and eventually the world, there had always been an underlying sadness in his victories, a sense that his greatest triumph would be incomplete until he could share it with the man who had helped create him, but had chosen not to stay around to watch him grow. The teenage years had been particularly difficult, as Manny struggled with anger and abandonment issues that manifested in reckless behavior and a desperate need to prove his worth to a world that seemed determined to overlook him. He had thrown himself into boxing with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction, using the physical pain of training to mask the emotional pain of growing up without a father's guidance. His early professional fights had been fueled as much by rage as by technique, each opponent representing the father who had failed to believe in him enough to stay and witness his transformation from street kid to world champion. The financial success that followed his boxing achievements had enabled Manny to provide for his mother and family in ways that would have seemed impossible during those early years of poverty. Yet even as he purchased houses and cars and ensured that his loved ones would never again know hunger, he had never been able to purchase the presence of the man who had walked away. He had often wondered during quiet moments whether Rosalio had followed his career from a distance, whether his father had felt pride or regret while watching his abandoned son become an international sensation, or whether the man had simply moved on with his life without ever looking back at the family he had left behind. Standing in his beautiful garden 30 years later, surrounded by the success and stability he had built through his own determination and the support of those who had chosen to stay in his life, Manny felt the full weight of those abandoned years pressing down upon him like a heavy training vest. The child within him still carried the scars of wondering whether he had somehow been responsible for his father's decision to leave, whether he had been too much trouble or not worthy enough of a father's love and commitment. These deep-seated insecurities had driven much of his incredible work ethic and his relentless pursuit of perfection in the ring, as if each victory might somehow prove to the absent father that he had been worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth loving enough to never abandon. Rosalio's weathered hands shook as he finally found the courage to respond, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of 3 decades spent living with the consequences of the most significant mistake of his life. The words that emerged were fractured and hesitant, as if each syllable required tremendous effort to push past the barriers of shame and regret that had built up over the years of separation. He spoke of the overwhelming pressure he had felt as a young father, struggling to provide for his family in the economy that offered few opportunities for men with limited education and even fewer resources. The poverty that had surrounded their household had felt like a suffocating blanket, and his inability to fulfill his role as provider had gradually eroded his sense of self-worth until he had convinced himself that his family would be better off without him. The envelope in his hands contained letters that he had written but never sent, birthday wishes that had accumulated year after year as he watched his sons rise to fame from the painful distance of his self-imposed exile. His eyes filled with tears as he described the nights he had spent listening to radio broadcasts of Manny's fights, feeling simultaneously proud of his son's achievements and devastated by his own absence from those crucial moments. He had followed every victory, every setback, every triumph through newspapers and television coverage, living vicariously through the success of the child he had abandoned, while knowing he had forfeited any right to claim connection to those accomplishments. The reason for his departure, Rosalio explained with halting words, had been a complex mixture of financial desperation and personal inadequacy that had culminated in a moment of catastrophic weakness. He had owed money to dangerous people, money that he had borrowed with the intention of starting a small business that would lift his family out of poverty, but the venture had failed and left him deeper in debt than ever before. The threats against his family had become serious enough that he had convinced himself that disappearing would protect them from the violence that seemed inevitable if he stayed. His decision to leave had been motivated by fear rather than abandonment. Though he acknowledged that the result had been the same regardless of his intentions, the years following his departure had been marked by a series of failed attempts to rebuild his life in distant provinces, always moving from place to place as he struggled to find steady work and meaning in a life defined by the family he had lost. He had remarried briefly, but the relationship had failed because he could never fully commit his heart to a new family, while knowing he had abandoned his first one. His health had deteriorated due to the stress and guilt of his choices, and he had developed diabetes and heart problems that served as constant reminders of the emotional toll his decision had taken on his body as well as his spirit. The decision to finally seek out Manny had been prompted by a recent heart attack that had forced Rosalio to confront his own mortality and the reality that he might die without ever attempting to bridge the gap he had created through his cowardice. His doctors had warned him that his time might be limited, and the prospect of leaving this world without at least trying to apologize to his son had become more unbearable than the fear of rejection he had carried for 3 decades. He had spent months gathering the courage to make this journey, rehearsing words that could never adequately express the depth of his remorse or repair the damage caused by 30 years of absence. The letters in the envelope represented his attempt to document the love he had always felt for his son, despite his inability to demonstrate that love through presence and support during the years when it had mattered most. Each letter corresponded to a major milestone in Manny's life that he had missed, from school graduations to boxing championships to political achievements, and contained the words he would have spoken if he had possessed the courage to remain in his son's life. His hands trembled as he offered the envelope to Manny, knowing that these written words were inadequate compensation for 30 years of silence, yet hoping they might serve as a starting point for whatever relationship, if any, might still be possible between a father who had failed and a son who had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Jinky had quietly moved closer during the conversation, her maternal instincts immediately recognizing the profound significance of this moment, despite not having heard all the details of the exchange between her husband and the unexpected visitor. Her years of marriage to Manny had taught her to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, and she could see the way his shoulders carried the sudden weight of emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm his usually composed exterior. As a wife who had stood beside him through his most challenging professional battles, she understood that this confrontation with his past represented a different kind of fight, one that required emotional rather than physical courage, and she positioned herself within reach should he need her support. The children had gradually become aware that something significant was occurring in their normally peaceful garden, with Princess and Queen Elizabeth moving closer to their parents with the intuitive understanding that children possess when sensing adult distress. Their young eyes moved between their father and the elderly stranger, trying to process the emotional intensity that seemed to radiate from both men like heat from a fire. Israel, still too young to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, continued his innocent play, while occasionally glancing toward the adults with the casual curiosity of childhood, unaware that he was witnessing a moment that would reshape his family's understanding of their own history. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway announced the arrival of Dionia Pacquiao, Manny's mother, who had come for her regular weekly visit with her grandchildren, completely unaware that she was about to confront the man who had abandoned her and their children 3 decades earlier. Her footsteps could be heard approaching through the house as she called out her usual cheerful greetings to her family, her voice carrying the warmth and strength that had sustained their household through the darkest years of their shared struggle. The approaching sound of her presence added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation, as Manny realized that his mother would soon face her own reunion with the man who had left her to raise their children alone. Jimule and Michael, Manny's older sons, had been practicing basketball in the side yard when they noticed the unusual gathering in the main garden area, and they approached with the cautious steps of young men who had inherited their father's ability to sense when situations required careful observation before action. Their teenage eyes quickly assessed the elderly visitor and registered the obvious emotional distress on their father's face, though they lacked the context to understand that they were looking at their grandfather for the first time in their conscious lives. The protective instincts they had developed as the sons of a famous father immediately activated, and they positioned themselves strategically to respond if this unknown visitor posed any threat to their family's security. Jinky gently placed her hand on Manny's arm, a gesture that had provided him comfort through countless difficult moments throughout their marriage, while her eyes remained focused on Rosalio as she tried to understand the full scope of what was occurring in her garden. Her own childhood had been marked by family stability and parental presence, making it difficult for her to fully comprehend the complexity of emotions that her husband was experiencing in this moment of unexpected reunion. Yet her love for Manny enabled her to sense his need for support without requiring complete understanding, and she remained close enough to provide whatever strength he might need to navigate this unprecedented situation. The approaching sound of Dionysia's footsteps grew louder as she made her way through the house toward the garden, her cheerful humming creating a stark contrast to the emotional intensity that had settled over the outdoor gathering like a heavy cloud. Manny's eyes moved between his father and the direction of his mother's approach, realizing that he would soon be required to facilitate a reunion between two people whose relationship had ended in pain and abandonment 30 years earlier. The weight of this responsibility added another layer of stress to his already overwhelmed emotional state. As he contemplated the potential consequences of this unexpected confrontation on his mother's well-being and his family's carefully constructed stability, standing in his garden surrounded by the symbols of his incredible success, Manny felt the familiar sensation of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Yet this time, the chemical surge was prompted not by an approaching boxing match, but by the most challenging emotional fight of his life. His mind cycled through the mental techniques he had developed over years of professional competition, searching for a strategy that might help him navigate this unprecedented situation with the same composure he had displayed in the ring against world-class opponents. However, he quickly realized that the skills that had made him a legendary fighter were inadequate preparation for confronting the deepest wounds of his childhood, wounds that had never fully healed despite all his professional achievements and personal growth. The champion who had conquered 8 different weight divisions and defeated some of the most dangerous men in the world suddenly felt as vulnerable as the 7-year-old boy who had watched his father walk away without explanation or promise of return. His hands, which had delivered knockout punches to world-class athletes, now trembled with the emotional impact of holding the letters his father had written but never sent, each envelope representing a missed opportunity for connection that could never be recovered. The physical training that had prepared his body for combat had not equipped him to handle the psychological impact of confronting 30 years of abandonment, disappointment, and the complex mixture of love and resentment that he felt toward the man standing before him. His thoughts turned to his own children, who were now witnessing their father in a state of emotional vulnerability that they had never seen before, and he worried about the impact this situation might have on their sense of security and family stability. Princess Ying, Queen Elizabeth, Israel, Jimuel, and Michael had grown up in a world of privilege and parental presence that stood in stark contrast to their father's childhood experience, and Manny felt a protective instinct to shield them from the pain and confusion that had marked his own formative years. Yet he also recognized that this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate to his children how a man handles difficult emotional situations with grace and integrity, even when faced with circumstances that challenge every fiber of his being. The financial success that had enabled him to provide his family with every material comfort seemed meaningless in the face of this emotional challenge that could not be resolved through wealth or achievement. His numerous championship belts, his political position, his business ventures, and his international fame all felt like inadequate armor against the pain of confronting the father who had missed every significant moment of his rise from poverty to worldwide recognition. The empty space in his heart that had driven much of his incredible ambition suddenly felt larger than ever, as if his father's presence had somehow made the absence more pronounced rather than filling the void that had existed for 3 decades. The deeply religious faith that had sustained him through his most difficult professional battles now provided his only source of guidance as he struggled to find the appropriate response to his father's unexpected return and request for forgiveness. His understanding of Christian principles regarding mercy, redemption, and the importance of family relationships created an internal conflict with the very human emotions of anger, resentment, and betrayal that surged through him each time he looked at Rosalio's weathered face. The teachings about forgiveness that he had embraced as an adult clashed with the wounded child inside him, who still demanded answers and accountability for 30 years of abandonment and missed opportunities for father-son bonding. The approaching sound of his mother's footsteps forced Manny to shift his focus from his own emotional turmoil to the practical challenge of managing what could become an explosive confrontation between his parents, 2 people whose relationship had ended in circumstances that had left deep scars on everyone involved. His role as both son and family protector required him to find a way to facilitate this reunion, while minimizing the potential for additional emotional damage to his mother, his wife, and his children, all of whom were about to be drawn into a family drama that had been frozen in time for 3 decades. The weight of this responsibility felt heavier than any championship belt he had ever carried, because the stakes involved the emotional well-being of the people he loved most in the world, rather than just his own professional legacy. Dionysia's figure appeared in the doorway leading from the house to the garden, her warm smile immediately fading as her eyes fell upon the man who had walked out of her life 3 decades earlier, leaving her to raise their children alone through years of poverty and struggle that had tested every ounce of her strength and determination. The small bag of fruit she had brought for her grandchildren slipped from her fingers and scattered across the stone pathway as the shock of recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her aged hands moved to her chest as if to steady her rapidly beating heart, while her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions that ranged from disbelief to anger, to a grief that had never fully healed despite the passage of so many years. The silence that followed her appearance stretched across the garden like a taut wire, with every member of the family frozen in place as they waited to see how this unprecedented reunion between Manny's parents would unfold. Rosalio's eyes met those of his former wife with a look of profound shame and regret, his earlier confidence in facing his son now replaced by the even more challenging task of confronting the woman he had abandoned during the most difficult period of their shared lives. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that could possibly bridge the vast emotional distance created by 30 years of separation and the accumulated weight of broken promises and shattered trust. Manny instinctively moved closer to his mother, his protective instincts activated by the obvious distress on her face and his concern that this emotional shock might be too much for her aging heart to handle safely. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder while keeping his eyes fixed on his father, prepared to intervene if this confrontation threatened to escalate beyond anyone's ability to manage constructively. The role reversal was not lost on him, as he found himself protecting his mother from the same man who should have been protecting their entire family all those years ago. Yet he also recognized that both of his parents were now elderly people who deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their shared painful history. Jinky quickly moved to gather the scattered fruits, while simultaneously keeping a watchful eye on her children, who were observing this family drama with wide eyes and obvious confusion about the identity of the elderly stranger who had caused such dramatic reactions from their beloved grandmother and father. Her practical nature kicked into action as she gently guided Princess Queen Elizabeth and Israel toward the house, recognizing that this conversation needed to occur without young children present to witness potentially destructive emotional exchanges between the adults. Jimuel and Michael, being older, remained in the garden but moved to a respectful distance that allowed them to provide support if needed while giving their father space to handle this delicate family situation. The afternoon light began to fade as the 3 adults stood in their triangle of complex emotions, each carrying their own version of the shared history that had brought them to this moment of reckoning. Dionysia's voice, when it finally emerged, was steady despite the obvious emotional turmoil she was experiencing, her years of single parenthood having taught her to maintain composure even in the most challenging circumstances. Her words were directed toward Rosalio, with a mixture of disappointment and strength that reflected the woman she had been forced to become after his departure. A woman who had learned to rely on her own resources and had successfully raised children who had exceeded everyone's expectations despite the absence of their father. Manny realized that this moment represented not just his own opportunity for closure with his father, but also his mother's chance to finally express 30 years of accumulated feelings toward the man who had left her to struggle alone during the most challenging period of their family's life. His decision about how to respond to his father's return would need to consider not only his own emotional needs, but also the impact on his mother, who had sacrificed so much to ensure that her children could succeed despite the disadvantages created by their father's abandonment. The weight of this family moment felt more significant than any championship fight he had ever faced, because the outcome would affect the people he loved most, rather than just his own professional legacy. And there would be no second chances if he failed to handle this situation with the wisdom and compassion that the moment demanded. As the golden hour light filtered through the garden, Manny found himself looking at his father through new eyes, seeing not just the man who had abandoned him, but also a flawed human being who had made a catastrophic mistake during a moment of overwhelming pressure and fear. The letters clutched in his hands represented 30 years of unexpressed love and regret, each envelope a testament to a father's enduring connection to the son he had left behind, even when that connection had been severed by his own choices. The realization that his father had followed his career from a distance, had felt pride in his achievements, and had carried the burden of his decision for 3 decades, began to shift something fundamental in Manny's understanding of their relationship and the complex motivations that had driven his father's behavior all those years ago. The conversation that followed was marked by tears, halting explanations, and the slow, careful process of 2 damaged people attempting to build a bridge across 3 decades of separation and pain. Dionysia's presence added both complexity and healing to the situation, as her questions and expressions of her own pain helped to illuminate the full scope of the damage that Rosalio's decision had caused to every member of their family. Yet her ultimate expression of forgiveness, born from her deep Christian faith and her recognition that holding on to anger had become more burdensome than letting it go, provided a model for the kind of grace that might make reconciliation possible, even after so many years of hurt and disappointment. Manny's children watched from the windows of the house as their father, grandmother, and the mysterious elderly visitor gradually moved from standing in rigid confrontation to sitting together on the garden bench, their body language slowly shifting from defensive postures to something that resembled the beginning of understanding, if not yet complete, reconciliation. The sight of their normally strong father wiping tears from his eyes provided them with an unexpected lesson about the complexity of adult emotions and the reality that even the strongest people carry wounds that can be reopened by unexpected encounters with their past. The decision about what role, if any, Rosalio would play in their family's future remained unresolved as the afternoon faded into evening. But the mere fact that conversation had occurred represented progress that none of them had believed possible just hours earlier. Manny recognized that forgiveness would be a process rather than a single moment, and that rebuilding trust with someone who had broken it so completely would require time, patience, and careful consideration of the needs of everyone affected by this unexpected reunion. His own children's security and his mother's emotional well-being would need to remain his primary concerns as he navigated whatever relationship might be possible with the father who had returned after 30 years of absence. The letters that his father had written but never sent became a bridge between their past and their potential future, each one offering insight into the man who had made the mistake of leaving and the father who had never stopped loving his son despite his inability to demonstrate that love through presence and support. Manny understood that reading these letters would be an emotional journey that might take weeks or months to complete, as each envelope would force him to confront another missed milestone, another moment when his father's absence had left a void that nothing else could fill. Yet he also recognized that these written words represented his father's attempt to maintain a connection even when physical presence had seemed impossible, and that understanding his father's perspective might help him to finally heal wounds that had shaped his entire life. As the family gathered for dinner that evening, with Rosalio hesitantly accepting an invitation to join them for the first family meal they had shared in 3 decades, Manny felt a cautious hope that perhaps some good could emerge from this painful confrontation with his past. The road ahead would be difficult, marked by careful conversations, gradual trust-building, and the challenge of integrating a repentant father into a family structure that had learned to function without him. Yet the possibility of healing, of forgiveness, and of finally filling the empty space that had driven so much of his incredible ambition represented a victory that might be even more meaningful than any championship he had ever won in the boxing ring. The evening ended with Rosalio being given a guest room for the night, a gesture that represented neither immediate forgiveness nor complete reconciliation, but rather a willingness to explore whether 30 years of separation could be bridged through understanding, patience, and the kind of love that had never truly disappeared despite being buried beneath layers of pain and disappointment. Manny knew that this story was just beginning, that the real work of rebuilding a father-son relationship would require the same dedication and persistence that had made him a champion, but for the first time in 30 years, he felt hope that the wounded child inside him might finally find the peace that had eluded him throughout his incredible journey from abandoned son to global icon.